of this Sunday address is going to be the case for self-defense. White supremacy is a group sport, but so is black empowerment. Black self-defense is a group sport too. That means protecting our economy as a group and protecting ourselves as a group. Now, for the few people out there who consider themselves to be colorblind, or the few black folks out there who are still clinging to the putrid corpse of the post-racial delusion, I think this last week should be a reminder, like few things have reminded us before, about how we are up against an organized offense. There was a white media embargo on this killing for days after it happened, but that embargo had to do with only one thing and one thing only: the identity of the killer. And it wasn't just one or two white media outlets who did it. It was every single one of them. They were all on code. This case has the white media shook. After Trayvon Martin was killed, the white media realized that they were slowly but surely beginning to lose momentum when it comes to the normalization and the promoting of killing black people with impunity. Every one of their little victories brought them closer to defeat, and then in 2020 the wheels fell off. Now, they tried to demonize Ahmaud Arbery and try to get some sort of little counteroffensive going, but that backfired. Their would-be country fried champions are now in the big house doing double life. So now the reprehensible and deliberate killing of Jordan Neely has occurred, and the white media thinks to themselves if they play this one the right way, they can finally get that little counteroffensive against black people going. Only problem is that unlike the killing of Trayvon Martin, this has gone the same way as George Floyd's killing. There's video of this one. So it's not just the white guy's word versus the black person he killed. And I say white guy because that was all the white media has said about him. For days on end, they only identified the man by his race. He was white, and he was a Marine. They made sure to say that too. This guy, he had been in the Marine Corps for a few years. Yeah, he did the basic enlistment and then bounced. That was it. Trying to make some sort of war hero out of this creep. And it was excruciatingly obvious to everyone. The white media knew exactly who this guy was. They had talked to him. They talked to his attorneys, but they didn't want anyone in the public to know who he was. And it was all of them. So instead, they just described him as a white male who had been in the Marines. Okay, since all the white media saw fit to mention was his race, that's how we'll address him. He's just a white guy. New York City has a long and putrid history of using violence as a way to drive black people out of the city. Most of the richest and most famous places in New York City were black enclaves a little over 100 years ago. The African Burial Ground was the site of a corporate tower and even an IRS office before a planned construction dig unearthed the bodies of some of the black residents who had lived and died there. There were draft riots in New York during the Civil War. Mobs of racist white supremacist marauders were lynching black people in the streets. And then it happened again 35 years later. Not many people talk about the New York race riot of 1900, but they should. It happened because on August 2nd, 1900, a black man, Arthur Harris, was out with his wife. Harris left her for a moment so he could go get a cigar. Then, when he came back, he found her being accosted by a white plainclothes patrolman named Robert Thorpe, who was grabbing her by the arm. The story was that Thorpe thought that she was soliciting. Harris saw Thorpe, and clearly Thorpe never identified himself, and Mr. Harris stepped in to protect his wife from this assailant. That's when Thorpe pulled his billy club and began beating Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris pulled a penknife that he kept on him for personal defense and killed Thorpe. 10 days later, Thorpe's funeral became a lightning rod for many violent-prone white supremacists in the city. They decided that someone needed to make sure that black people in New York knew their place. So for the next 4 days, the New York riot of 1900 rampaged through the city. An estimated 10,000 young white people took part in the carnage, but it wasn't just roaming bands of young white supremacist marauders who were attacking any black person they could come across. The New York police were also heavily involved in the rampage as well. This is how the August 17th, 1900 edition of the New York Times reported it. Headline: A disgrace to the police. The record of the police in the riotous attacks on the Negroes in their quarter on Wednesday night may briefly be summed up. They stood idly by for the most part while the Negroes were being beaten, except when they joined savagely in the sport, until the rioting threatened to extend dangerously. Then they gradually dispersed the crowds, arresting almost no whites and many blacks, most of the latter being clubbed most unmercifully. It tells of cruelty, of the brutal cowardice of armed men assaulting helpless men and women, of violent race prejudice, and it tells of the implicit confidence on the part of the offending officers that they will not be called to account by their superiors. The plain fact is that there was no excuse whatsoever for the brutality of the police. If there were a spark of decency or self-respect in the minds of the police commissioners, the offenders would be sharply pursued and severely disciplined. Of that, there is little hope. Now, that excerpt from the New York Times wasn't written in 2020. It wasn't even written in the 1960s or the 1930s. That was written over 120 years ago. The New York Police Department being active participants in racial violence against black people is not a new phenomenon at all. It's been going on since the very beginning. The New York Times was certainly a lot more accurate and clear on race during Jim Crow than they are today. The New York riot of 1900 happened because those white supremacist marauders heard that a black man had been beaten by the police and dared to actually defend himself. It was the claim that a black man protected himself that made them go berserk. I cite these past events so that you understand things haven't changed there at all. In fact, in recent years, it's actually gotten worse. Why are so many New York politicians so eager to stick up for someone who they know to be a cowardly killer? It's because for decades now, there's been an ongoing project by New York's wealthy white elite to ethnically cleanse the city of black people by any means possible. This latest push has been going on since at least the 1980s. They tried to schmooze us out of town with Ed Koch. That backfired spectacularly. Then they sent in the do-nothing goofy David Dinkins to be their bumbling black frontman for white power. That was a bust. I guess they figured that if low-down Willie Brown was a hit out there in California, they could replicate the same thing on the East Coast. But it didn't work. Then they decided to put aside all pretense and just go full whole hog, and they brought in an unabashed racist, Rudy Giuliani. That was when the gentrification of New York kicked into high gear. Now, a lot of people say that there were a whole lot of shops and cosmopolitan venues that went up under the Giuliani administration. First of all, that can only happen in New York City if the wealthy white elites and the city council are all on the same page. And they were. This wasn't about putting up new shops or office buildings or about renovating dilapidated structures. It was about driving up property taxes and leases so that only people making six figures a year can afford to be in New York. And it was also about instituting a full-on racial apartheid onslaught through the police. The racial targeting of black people had to be greatly intensified, and that's exactly what Giuliani did. And then came Michael Bloomberg. He helped to put the lie to all the crap Democrats said about how they were different than Republicans. Michael Bloomberg was so racist, he got David Duke's endorsement. He made it clear that he would continue the city's refusal to pay the Central Park Five for the pain and suffering caused to them. All the anti-black policies that Giuliani put in place, Michael Bloomberg greatly expanded and reinforced, like the infamous Stop and Frisk program, whose only purpose was to racially harass black New Yorkers. Bloomberg went further than even Giuliani did when he said that they weren't stopping and frisking enough black people. Now, with all the disparities in New York, can you remember even one time that Bloomberg or any mayor of New York went to white New Yorkers and told them that they needed to be arrested more, locked up, that they had it too easy, they had it too good? Of course not. Nobody ever talks to white voters like that, but they talk to black people like that all the time. Michael Bloomberg went on to call New York a luxury product, saying that businesses should accept having to pay more to operate there. But of course, if businesses have to pay more, that means the residents do as well, which went unsaid but was fully understood by all. Bill de Blasio, with his black wife, did nothing for black New Yorkers as a whole, though at least he did make sure the Central Park Five finally got a settlement check. And now we have Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD, proving that that putrid institution hasn't changed one iota in 120 years. Officer Adams was auditioning loudly as he could from the very start. He even brought in the old "what about black on black" crime canard with him. And he wasn't alone. You also have the racist governor Kathy Hochul, though given her attitude, I think we'll have to start calling her Karen Hochul. So you have the two most influential politicians in New York State both on the same page against black people, openly, aggressively against black people. They want to make it loud and clear black people are the problem in New York City. When news of the heinous killing of Jordan Neely broke, the white media initially tried to ignore it, but once social media got it, that plan went out the window, so the goal then was radio silence on the killer and demonize the victim nonstop. All we've seen is article after article saying, what do we know about Jordan Neely? First thing they lead off with is, well, you do know he had some priors, and he had mental health issues, so this is just a troubled, violent man, don't you know? They just repeat that non-stop, repeating any unfounded rumor that they can find, any unsubstantiated gossip that he was threatening people. And as for evidence of these claims, hey, who needs that? This is about dirtying up the black victim, same as they've done with all the others. See, this is the same white media who tried to claim that Daniel Pantaleo was just a law-abiding, dedicated flatfoot. And then we found out later, predictably, that this guy had been successfully sued for racial profiling and even sued for police brutality. The city of New York had to fork out over $100,000 to settle those lawsuits, but the white media didn't want to tell you about that. It would have gone against the narrative. But they did make sure to mention, well, Eric Garner, he once got nabbed for some loose cigarettes he was selling, not on the day he was killed, though. And then the politicians in New York weighed in on the killing of Jordan Neely, and not surprisingly, they were squarely on the side of the killer without being able to tell anyone why. They talked out of both sides of their mouths, simultaneously saying that the public needs to calm down, let the investigation play out, it's still ongoing. And then in the very same breath, they didn't hesitate to pass judgment on Jordan Neely, a man who was killed. He's not even here to speak up for himself. He had some priors, we heard. Crime in New York subways, people have to feel safe, Jordan Neely didn't kill anyone. Daniel Penny did. But nobody mentions that. That doesn't come up. Governor Hochul and Officer Eric Adams were going all in for the killer and being bold about it. The racist governor of New York was bold, saying, well, there's consequences for behavior,
One element we have not talked about is the $1 billion investment we have in mental health services, so we don't have people who are homeless in our subways, many of them in the throes of mental health episodes, and that's what I believe are some of the factors involved here. And there's consequences for behavior, and I look at it more closely to find out whether the state has a role. People who've been out on parole have different consequences, and a judge can make a decision on whether to hold someone, or a DA can make a decision to charge them. But in the case where someone is on parole, then the state has an ability, as we've done before in more serious cases, to ensure that someone is held.
Now, remember, she said that they didn't know what had happened here. The facts were still being investigated. But she didn't say that there was no reason to strangle someone to death. She made an open, clear condemnation about the man who was killed. This was an endorsement of killing a black person. Well, if that's the standard that Governor Kathy Hochul wants to put in place, would she say the same thing if it was one of these Karens who was killed like that? Kathy Hochul is the same age and ethnicity as the vast majority of Karens we see acting out. Does anyone think that if it was a Karen who was choked to death by anyone of any race, that Kathy Hochul would ever say, well, there's consequences for behavior, Can you think of any white woman who has ever been killed that Kathy Hochul has ever brought up any priors on, or any politician for that matter, or alluded to them being a threat? They never do that. Even Karens who pull guns on unarmed shoppers or pedestrians. Because we have videos every single day of Karens acting out, and they do a lot more than just yell at people on the subway. They throw things, physically assault people, pull guns. So does that behavior also carry consequences, Governor Hochul? That's the new standard, right? If someone were to put Karens in a chokehold and strangle them, the governor would probably never say, well, Karens do frighten people, screaming at people, threatening people, hitting people, making fraudulent calls to the police. We've all seen the videos. It's a part of why people are scared, because you never know when some Karen will attack, and the DAs refuse to prosecute and the judges refuse to hold them in prison, so people are scared. Is that how she would be talking? Remember the so-called Soho Karen? She was the white Latina who violently attacked a black child last year. She wasn't just yelling or being unpleasant to people at that hotel. She attacked a child in public. Now, the black father of that child, if he had decided that rather than just pull her off of his son, instead that he would, quote-unquote, accidentally choke her to death, would Kathy Hochul be saying, well, there's consequences for behavior? The Soho Karen, she also has priors in California for the exact same kind of behavior, but the white media didn't make much mention of that at all, and neither did the politicians. And what consequences were there for that crime, attacking a child in broad daylight in front of a hotel full of witnesses? Alvin Bragg was the newly elected DA. He had taken office some weeks earlier, and what did he do about this? He released her. No time served. That's what he did. And not one Republican has ever said, well, this proves that Alvin Bragg is soft on crime. There was no whining from Fox News about woke DA lets criminals go free. All of a sudden, they forgot their talking points, at least for that one they forgot. See, I've been critical of Alvin Bragg since he announced his candidacy. I know that he made some black folks in New York's hearts go pitter-pat because he made one blink-and-you'll-miss-it mention of Daniel Pantaleo, and just a little bit of empty musing, some loose talk that he might want to maybe, perhaps, re-examine the Eric Garner killing if he became DA. Well, no promises, but every once in a blue moon, he kind of gave an errant thought to it. But as soon as he became DA, as we see, that was another of his broken promises. I was dismissive of this hot air because absolutely nothing in Alvin Bragg's resume or his character even hinted that he would take a stand for black people. If anything, Alvin Bragg has much more in common with Rudy Giuliani. Both of them are former U.S. attorneys turned politicians, both of them trying to climb the political ladder to higher office. And in Bragg's case, he knows that means you have to stay in the good graces of the wealthy white racist elite in New York. People like Michael Bloomberg. And that means you have to go along with their ethnic cleansing agenda and to maintain racial immunity from the law for certain folks. Well, we can all see what decision Alvin Bragg made. These bootlicks sell out completely to white power. They sell their souls, which weren't worth much to begin with. From Alvin Bragg to Officer Adams to Barack Obama, they have all taken the pledge to offer the black community up as human sacrifices to purchase themselves lives of comfort and wealth under white supremacy. Had Daniel Penny been black, and the victim any color other than black, Kathy Hochul will be saying, you can't take the law into your own hands because there's more cameras and more police, etc. That's what she would be saying. We got all these safety measures in place. All you got to do is call the police. We don't want people taking the law into their own hands. And we know that's the case because practically every black person who's protected themselves from a white supremacist attack has wound up being the one arrested and put on trial. And it never takes a public outcry to get it done, like John White, who protected his family from a literal lynch mob in Long Island after that racist gang had attacked his son. He protected his family and himself on his own property, and he was immediately arrested and put in prison. And it didn't take any public marches or demonstrations to get it done either. No white-splaining from the allegedly liberal New York politicians either. Nobody was saying, well, if you beat someone's child at a party, then drive to that person's house with your friends in the middle of the night and terrorize their family, well, there's consequences for behavior. Nobody was saying that at all about John White. The white media put his name out immediately. It didn't take any 5 or 6 days and for the public to have to unearth his identity themselves. And they didn't write even one article praising or lauding this man as a loving, doting father and business owner, nor did they demonize the deceased. The speech they make is always exactly the opposite when they're talking about black people. Understand, these are racial code words that these anti-black racists are using because they never bring out the same talking points at any other time. Soft on crime, quote unquote, never applies to people like Dylan Roof, who was arrested for drugs yet allowed to get guns immediately afterwards. Soft on crime was not once used when talking about the police who took Roof to Burger King right after he murdered a church full of black grandmothers. Taking a mass murderer to Burger King is about the most soft on crime thing you could possibly do. But nobody was talking about woke police departments and taking mass killers to lunch and how that's coddling criminals and how it encourages lawlessness. Michael Jackson impersonators are not a threat to New York public safety, but killers like this Daniel Penny creep and these Karens are. I mean, this piece of trash, Kathy Hochul, she actually was demonizing this man in death. He's not here to speak up for himself, and that's the reason why she did it. Best time to demonize a black person is if you know that there's no chance that they'll be able to speak against you. We'll continue with the moment of truth in just a moment, but first, a word from the official sponsor of Black Empowerment, Power Tools. There's no telling when something's going to come up, so make sure you carry your power tools at all times. You never know when you're going to need to bring the hammer down. or when you'll have some trash that needs to be blown away, or some obstacle that requires cutting down. Don't get caught empty-handed. Keep your hammer close by. Keep that leaf blower at the ready. And always carry your steel. Power tools. Because no matter what your day job or side hustle may be, there's no excuse for not being ready to put in some work. The white media also jumped on that train from the jump. They spent days concealing the background of the killer, even his name, and I cannot overstate that. For day after day after day, the white media refused to say who the killer was. But instead, they ran stories saying that they talked to the killer, they talked to his lawyers, telling the public, well, take our word for it, he was in the Marines. They only said things that they thought would make him look good. And this was all of them. Not a single white media outlet, not even one, including your so-called independent white media, published the guy's name. They were trying to create a phony narrative. This was an across-the-board white media embargo on his identity, but they did want to make sure that they told you he had been in the Marines, as if that means he's a good guy. Let me tell you something. Charles Whitman, he was the infamous Texas Bell Tower sniper. He was also a mass killer, by the way. He had been in the Marines. Lee Harvey Oswald had also been in the Marines. Timothy McVeigh was in the Army. Stuart Rhodes, the founder and leader of the Oath Keepers, you remember them. He was one of the people who masterminded the January 6th insurrection. Stuart Rhodes was in the Army. So you got the white media, who normally does not laud any killer's military record, because that kind of makes people think, oh, this person's predisposed to kill, aren't they? Instead, in this case, they want that to be the only thing you know about him. Well, he was in the Marine Corps, and he was a decorated veteran. He served in Iraq. Decorated veteran. He got some medals. Let me tell you something. If you stay in the military at all and just finish your first enlistment period, you're going to walk out with a few decorations. You'll have yourself a medal for marksmanship. You'll have yourself a couple of ribbons for cleaning your plate in mess hall, that kind of thing. Saying that somebody is a decorated veteran these days doesn't mean what it used to. You get freaking decorations, quote unquote, simply for the fact that you were able to get in the military in the first place. You finish your enlistment period, you're going to have something you can point to and say, I got myself a couple of ribbons, I got myself a medal or a citation for whatever. This piece of trash who killed Jordan Neely, he went into the military just so he could get the government to pay for his college tuition. He didn't go to serve America, because as soon as his very first enlistment period was up, he was out of there. He's okay, goodbye Uncle Sam. This is the white media going full Nazi here, trying to stack the deck in favor of a killer before they even tell you his name. And this was a concerted effort across the board by all of them. This was an organized effort by the white media to do this. And you can tell because as many white media outlets as there allegedly are, not even one of them put out his name. And as we know, most of them had it already. They knew exactly who the guy was. This is the white media executing a plan, one they've been working on for a very long while now, to twist public perception through censorship and disinformation. Or does anyone believe that the very same white media who spent the better part of a week refusing to publish the killer's name would tell you if he has a dishonorable service record? Do you think that these guys are going to be honest about whether or not he has any priors? You think they're trying to dig up any dirt on him or find out if this guy's got any sort of complaints against him? You think that after a week of protecting this guy, doing everything they could to conceal his identity and making sure to be his biggest cheerleader and defender, that they actually want you to know if he's done any dirt? The white media is not trying to hide their bias, and that's the point. They want us to know that they're on the side of the killer. This is open Nazi propaganda. You kill a black person in the government, and the white media will demonize your victim, and they'll do everything that they can to protect you. You have the governor and mayor in New York both attacking the victim, the white media who is doing the same. You know that the ties between the white government and the media are incestuous, particularly when it comes to the police. So this is a program at work here. Here's another one for you. Associated Press's headlines are acting as counsel for the defense. They say that the case is going to hinge on reasonableness. Well, only one person decided to attack Mr. Neely. Only one person put him in a chokehold. Other passengers who were there told the killer to stop, and he ignored them. So we know what reasonable behavior was, because the only person who attacked and killed Mr. Neely was Daniel Penny. There were plenty of other people there, but they didn't do that. The other passengers were telling him to stop. He ignored them. They even said that they feared that the man was dead. These were some of the same scum who, by the way, had been accomplices in killing Jordan Neely. And yet you have the Italian-American named Walter Signorelli being quoted by the AP as saying, He did what he thought was right and what seemed reasonable to him. First of all, the legal standard for reasonableness in New York is not what is reasonable to the perpetrator of the crime. The legal standard is that they must prove any reasonable person would have done the same. Well, there was a train car full of other New Yorkers that day, and not one of them strangled Mr. Neely to death. However, multiple bystanders, including some of the people who the white media says helped to restrain Mr. Neely, they told Daniel Penny he was going to kill the man. He was being told that by the people who had helped him to assault Mr. Neely. So the people who were there and even took part in the crime said that it wasn't reasonable to strangle the man, and that Daniel Penny needed to stop. And then this Signorelli creep says, he's stepping up where most people turn away. You read that correctly. This bastard said that sneaking up behind an unarmed person and strangling them to death is stepping up. By the way, this Signorelli creep, he was in the NYPD. Just more proof that absolutely nothing's changed with that corrupt racist organization in 120 years. And this is who the Associated Press, or as I like to call them, the Aryan propagandists, chose to talk to. Keep in mind, this is the same Associated Press that filed a lawsuit so that they could get Trayvon Martin's school disciplinary record because they were looking for some dirt on him. They were looking to see if they could find out, well, has he been suspended? Did he have disciplinary problems? Something we can use to dirty him up. They filed a lawsuit so that they could try to demonize a child. And here they are, giving a platform to a New York police flatfoot turned quack academic so that he could praise a killer as stepping up. This guy admitted to what the ethos of the NYPD is. Ambush killings are stepping up. Most people wouldn't commit racial ambush killings, but the NYPD understands they're carrying out a race war against black people, and Daniel Penny was doing his part. You want to know why Kyle Rittenhouse was able to gun down 3 people, killing 2 of them, and the police waved at him and praised him while they passed him by, seeing what he had done and still waved at him, gave him a thumbs up? Why is it that Dylan Roof could murder a church full of black people, mostly grandmothers, and the white police officers took him to Burger King? It's because trash like Walter Signorelli are in these police departments. When I tell you that the Kyle Rittenhouses and Dylan Roofs and Peyton Gendrys and Daniel Pennies are the irregular forces of white supremacy, this is what I mean. Police rely on them to carry out the kind of ambush killings that the Walter Signorellis think are a little bit too overt, a little bit too risky for them to initiate. As I've documented for you on this very YouTube channel, from the draft riots to the race riot of 1900 New York City, the police have always been the central core element of these race riots. They've always been the ones at the very heart of it, acting as not just the ringleaders and cheerleaders for it, but they're the ones leading it. As black people, we need to start recognizing that these killings are not some random thing. There's a plan at work here. Stop and frisk wasn't some unintentionally racist policy. It was Michael Bloomberg and others who settled on that idea as a great way to harass black New Yorkers and to use it as a framework for ethnically cleansing the city. So black people need to understand that when you have the governor of the state respond to a video of a person being violently strangled to death with, well, there's consequences for behavior. She's not talking about the killer. That is a racist politician giving an open invitation and encouragement to go kill some black people. Now, what's to be done? The only way to respond to an organized offense is with an organized defense. Self-defense. We have the right to protect ourselves and to protect other black people who are being attacked. You have to make the mental transition to the fact that these white supremacists are waging war on us. And it's been done with the open, blatant, and aggressive collaboration and protection of the government and the white media. Every black person must be ready to defend themselves. You can't afford to act as if you won't be next. We know the names of countless black victims of white supremacist violence, and not one of them thought they would be next, until they were. These white supremacists are carrying out a war against us, and if you go through a war trying to be casual, you'll become a casualty. As black people, we have to be aggressively on code about black people's right to self-defense. We don't need to take an opinion poll or ask anyone's permission. Some folks are waiting for the society to say that they finally approve of us protecting our own lives. That society is going to finally say that the police won't violate the law by trying to put us in prison simply for protecting ourselves from violent attacks. That's never going to happen, and you shouldn't be looking for it. When people see that we no longer are soft targets, then these racial ambushes will stop. But that will require a consistent defense on our part. That means preparation and vigilance. Now, I know a lot of black people have a problem with being on a self-defense footing because for them it's unpleasant or quote-unquote stressful to have to face every day like that. Well, being killed by some white supremacists who think they caught you slipping is far worse. Next, we have to show that we have the will and the power to punish governmental officials who cheerlead for us being killed. The killing and cover-up of the Jordan Neely slaying was in a blue city, in what's supposed to be a blue state. That's because anti-black racism is a bipartisan issue. It's one thing that both Republicans and Democrats fully agree on. And you have these Democratic politicians tripping over their shoelaces to defend killing black people because they're willing slaves of white power. Eric Adams, he's the New York version of Steven from Django. That mumble-mouthed, horse-faced piece of trash is no different than any other white supremacist you can name. In 2020, the behavior of these white supremacists had consequences, and it was nationwide. And their behavior changed when they thought that maybe that was going to be the new normal. But now we see these racists are trying to slither their way back to the way things were before. And it's your so-called liberal New York City that's leading the charge. Notice that? It ain't the red states doing it, it's liberal New York doing it. Now you see why Andrew Cuomo didn't want a racial profiling law to be passed. And even when the laws are on the books, as in the case of racist Amy Cooper, these racist DAs refuse to enforce them. And nobody in the white media says they're soft on crime. Oh no, nobody was saying that about Amy Cooper, or you just didn't prosecute Amy Cooper, or you're soft on crime. Republicans don't call Democratic prosecutors soft on crime when they refuse to prosecute white offenders. Black people need to understand something. What we've been told is the law is nothing more than a feeble collection of administrative pretenses. It is a societal fiction meant to con the gullible into thinking that there's some rule book that the nation is supposed to live by and that the rules are more or less fair. And if you disagree with the rules, well, you can write a letter to your congressman, etc. This legal fraud makes otherwise active people sit on their hands while the corrupt and the lawless trample our rights every second of the day. But as we, the black media, have documented for you time and again, these prosecutors don't make decisions on what charges to bring against people based on the law. They routinely ignore the law for certain offenders and then come at black people with charges for things they know we didn't even do. The so-called law under white supremacy is nothing more than a fiction. As I've long taught you in practice, the law is whatever the people are willing to abide by. That was the lesson of the 2020 uprisings. For years and years, the white media had lectured black people, well, the reason that the police can't get charged, much less convicted, the reason the prosecutors can't charge them is because, well, qualified immunity. That was the talking point they all decided to hide behind. That was going to be the talking point. That's the point. Okay, we're going to just say qualified immunity to everything. We'll just put that on a broken record. Qualified immunity. What day of the week is it? Qualified immunity. We were told that all a thug with a badge has to do is to claim they were afraid for their life, and that was their get-out-of-jail-free card. People were frustrated because they actually believed what the white media told them. We, the black media, however, told you that those were complete lies. And in 2020, the pot finally boiled over. The people fought back against these white supremacist thugs, and they also fought back against these DAs. And what was the result? All of a sudden, these same prosecutors who told us that they couldn't do anything were magically able to charge the police, and the juries were able to convict, and they did it so easily. It happened immediately. No new laws on the books, no new statutes, in fact, no elections. There had been no elections passed in 2020 by the summer of that year, and yet you saw these things changing because the people took to the streets and got in the bad guys' faces. Now, the judges, who I've told you for 10 years are the police's last ditch, they've been derailing the course of justice by illegally giving sentences so light they might as well be acquittals, but that's a separate issue. The point is, there wasn't a single law changed. Not one new law was put on the books. Not one new politician was put in office, and yet, because the people took to the streets and made it clear they weren't playing around, the lies and the liars were forced to have to actually abandon that whole qualified immunity excuse. These corrupt and racist prosecutors were exposed, and so was the white media. So you see, the problem was never the laws. It was that the prosecutors were deliberately and intentionally refusing to enforce the laws. Now, there is no law in the books that says that you can't bring hate crimes charges against a white supremacist who harms a black person, but there doesn't have to be. Because as we've seen countless times at the state and federal levels, there is clearly an unwritten understanding by America's prosecutors across the country that they don't bring hate crimes charges when a black person's been harmed by some white supremacist. Who they charge and what they charge the person with is not based on the law. It's based on their own personal prejudices and what they think is politically expedient for themselves. And as long as it looked like the people were willing to abide by that, these slimy prosecutors were happily ignoring the law. And then the people rose up. But as we saw in the case of George Floyd, these racist prosecutors make it clear they're openly opposed to prosecuting white supremacists. They had a slam dunk conviction against the murderers of Ahmaud Arbery, but that tether in the DOJ, Kristen Clark, she didn't want to have a conviction. The Biden DOJ's entire purpose behind bringing charges against Ahmaud Arbery's murderers was simply so that they could get them out of that dirty, filthy state prison in Georgia and instead have them serve their time in some federal country club facility upstate. Now here's something for you to keep in mind. Next time some idiot calls themselves pretending like they don't know what white supremacy is, and they try to call themselves quizzing you on the definition of white supremacy, you tell them this. White supremacy is the absolute control of society using physical, economic, political, and social violence for the exclusive benefit of those classified as white at the total expense of those who are not. That's white supremacy in a nutshell. It's a practical definition and one I think worth knowing. It explains what white power is supreme over, how it maintains its supremacy, and who it benefits. The reason you see these white supremacists going full Neanderthal right now is because, unlike black people, the enemy is ultra hypersensitive to even the prospect of taking an L. That's why hearing Daniel Penny's name being publicized and the public saying that they demand that he be held accountable for his crimes is making these guys go nuts. These guys, they cannot have any L's. They don't know how to react to it. White supremacy is fragile. That's why it has to rely on lies and manipulation to sustain itself, like a parasite. Every L they take sets them up for the next L. But because white supremacy is fragile and weak, they can't take too many before they fall. And this incident also highlighted, as much as anything could, how completely dangerous and self-hating these tethers are. I know we have family from the islands, Britain, and Africa who are on code. I see your comments. They are as dedicated to the fall of white supremacy as any of us are. They give moral support, material encouragement, they spread the word and all the rest of it. I am not at all confused that we've got on-code family from abroad and who are active in black empowerment. But there's also an ugly reality that has to be faced if we're going to actually have group self-defense. Global Pan-Africanism could never work because there is no Pan-Africanism in Africa. Everyone is so devoted to tribalism, and even then they play those little backstabbing games within their own tribes. So many non-black foreigners have come to Africa over the millennia and been able to destabilize the place and take over because too many Africans think that it's cute to play these little games. There's no enforcement mechanism within the African diaspora, no sense of blackness that crosses all ethnic, religious, and geographical lines. Hell, when they come over here, the first thing they say is, I ain't black. And for millennia, invaders and colonizers from the West and the North have taken full advantage of that. And in the Caribbean, it's no better. People like Candace Owens and Cheryl Lee Ralph bend over backwards to exalt their Jamaican heritage as making them superior to us. But that's all hot air and empty talk. They don't live in Jamaica or the Virgin Islands. Their parents left there and never looked back. And these tethers only go there to vacation, and even then they make sure to stay in the exact same locations as the white tourists do. They do nothing to build up the places that they claim to be so proud of. This is someone who's trying to create a non-black identity as an immigrant. That's why whenever the subject of DACA or the DREAM Act comes up, you get these black immigrants who get all excited when it doesn't even apply to them. When African and Caribbean immigrants are killed or harmed by the police, like Amadou Diallo, Abner Louima, Patrick Dorisman, Akai Gurley, Botham Jean, and most recently, Ralph Yarl, it is we, black Americans, the FBA contingent, who ride for them. We're the ones who are out in the streets by the tens of thousands. I want to know, where were the thousands of Jamaicans and people from the islands to support Akai Gurley when he was murdered? The Asian community came out coast to coast to support his killer, Peter Liang. And even though there happen to be schisms and these fractures within the Asian community based on their home countries, Koreans not getting along with Japanese and such, looking down on Southern Asians and all that, they put all that aside when Peter Liang was charged. They put all that to the side. It's all of a sudden, we got a definition of Asian that crosses all those lines. So I'm curious, where were Akai Gurley's people at? You might have had one or two out there, but for the most part, they were laying low. Amadou Diallo was from Guinea. He got gunned down in a hail of bullets for no reason. Where was the Guinean government? Where were the Guineans at in the U.S. to demand justice? Abner Louima is Haitian. After those NYPD degenerates violated him, the Haitians were largely absent. Not totally, but there was no mass turnout of Haitians in New York to stick up for him. We were the ones out there. Nobody else was. Botham Jean was from St. Lucia. He was murdered by a white cop in Texas. Black Americans went to the mat for him. TBA took out billboards demanding his murderer be punished. But I want to know, where was the St. Lucian community in the U.S. at to turn out for him? Now, St. Lucia's a tiny island. Even if all of them came to the U.S., it wouldn't amount to very many people. The only reason you even know that Botham Jean was killed was because we, the Black American contingent, we made sure people knew about it. We were the ones who went to the mat and spent months demanding that Amber Geiger get the maximum sentence. But it was Botham Jean's own family who went out of their way to go hugging up on the murderer in open court on camera in front of the whole world. They were giving a middle finger to every black person who got out there and demanded justice. Now you compare that, on the other hand, to the family of Tatiana Jefferson. She was also killed by a white supremacist in a Texas police uniform. And her father, literally with his dying breath, said he didn't want any hugs, that he would see justice done in this life, or when her killer died, he would see him in hell. Look at the family of Ahmaud Arbery. They took that fight national. They took it all the way. They weren't looking for any hugs. They didn't want any apologies either. They wanted their son's murderers to be punished, put those animals in a cage. And it was the tether Kristen Clark of Biden's DOJ who pulled an illegal maneuver trying to offer the killers a sweetheart plea deal behind the family's back. And then when the family confronted Clark about it in court, her representatives told the judge, ignore the family. Give the murderers a lighter sentence. That'll bring the family peace. This was them slapping the family in the face. It was the families protesting and demanding that the judge not sign off on that sellout plea deal that kept Ahmaud Arbery's killers from getting a cushy time in prison instead of the hard time they deserve. This is what Kristen Clark, a tether, did to an FBA family in open court. People like Botham Jean's family and Kristen Clark's, they don't care about the people who put in all that time to demand justice. All they saw was a chance to ingratiate themselves with the dominant society over another black person's dead body. Tethers are only out for themselves. They're basically an ethnic group of one. And when I look at the video of Jordan Neely being killed and who it was who took part in taking his life, you understand just how dangerous this problem is. We were the ones flying the flag for all black people's issues around the world. The problem is we were doing it alone. We thought that if we just kept at it long enough, the other 90% of the diaspora would eventually get on code. But we had to accept that what we were selling, they simply weren't buying. Yes, we've got some rioters from abroad, but they're the minority. That's a fact. So the next step for us is putting a robust mechanism in place to support black people who exercise their right of self-defense. Men like John White cannot be allowed to go to prison simply because he stopped a literal lynch mob that literally came to his front door. Too many black people have hesitated in the face of white supremacist aggression. And the reason that they did so is because they understand that the government, starting with the police and the prosecutors, are on the side of the white supremacists. What black people need to know is that there's other black people who have their backs. That's why during the uprisings of 2020, you had brothers like TBA and Tariq who were getting people out on bail. And these police, they were shook by that. They were reduced to crying on white TV networks like Fox News, it ain't fair. When black people stand up to white supremacy, when they defend themselves and other black people, we need to support their right to self-defense. Hesitation is the enemy of progress. And as we've seen with all these black people killed in these ambush killings, it only takes a second to take a life, but it only takes a second to save a black life too. When you see a black person being harmed by some white supremacist or some other branch of anti-black racist, that's a chance for you to stop an injustice. That's an opportunity for you to show you're on code. We're not going to hide from this fight, and we're not going to be targets either. Bootlicks are cowards, so they crawl on their bellies and hope that white power will let them have a comfortable place to die, and that's all they're going to get for their butt kissing. Well, over here in the black grassroots, we know better. History has shown that the only safe place to be under white supremacy is fighting it. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. New MVRC, Earl Jackson, Quasi, John Guillory, and Kenneth Prescia. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.